Well, I think I should echo what Suzanne just mentioned because the monsoon wind was a highly symbolic project, and the MD of Electricity of Laos is also here. We were the only international bank involved in this transaction, but as Suzanne, you highlighted, this was a multi-year effort. I think the original journey started off in 2011 to get to 650 megawatts of financing, which is the largest wind farm in Southeast Asia. But the interesting part of that transaction was the partnerships between various organizations, obviously led by ADB, but a lot of other multilaterals joined, some Thai financial institutions joined, and SMBC as the only international financial institution was quite glad to be part of it. The other transaction which just comes to my mind is, as in we've been talking about hydrogen for a number of years. Again, SMBC was fortunate to be involved in the largest I would say, green hydrogen project financing. This was a project still in Asia, but in Saudi Arabia, called NEOM Green Hydrogen Project, where essentially the developer, which is Aqua, is working to build the largest green hydrogen project, which eventually will export green hydrogen or supply to Air Products of the US. So again, that was a $6+ billion of financing raised from a number of international banks. So again, I think the interesting thing about these two transactions is how do we scale this up? Yeah, I guess it's a tough question because it depends on country, sector, and type of transactions. But if
the deals that you mentioned,
yeah. But I guess if I can generalize based on deals we worked on, again, we were involved in the first large greenfield wind farm project in Indonesia called Sidrap. That was a few years back, and it was not easy because there was not enough wind data, there was not enough historical information about how to go about financing that transaction. It was a 120 megawatt deal. So it took a number of years, but actually, ultimately, once it got financed, it was very successfully refinanced very soon after that, because the key is the construction and completion part of the risk is the biggest risk in these kind of transactions. So my observation, just taking that transaction, is how do countries in Southeast Asia build scale? Again, I know Jason said renewable is mainstream, but in some Southeast Asian countries, it's not yet mainstream. In India, definitely it's mainstream because they built this entity called SECI, which became a counterparty to a lot of solar and wind and around-the-clock projects, which allowed the risk to be transferred to some extent to a party which is a lot more credible. But if I look at the Southeast Asian countries, that remains a challenge because we haven't been able to scale up from one or two transactions. So I believe monsoon should lead to a number of other similar transactions going forward rather than just one-off.
Is India a template, therefore? The SECI structure, the template of take and so on. Is that some kind of a template that we can look at?
Yeah, again, I think it has worked quite well in India. And now if you look at the cost of electricity generation from renewable sector, it is significantly dropped, and it is one of the most competitive market for renewable energy. And interestingly, now there is a company called Greenco in India, which is going to buy renewable energy from the grid, and they're going to complement that with pumped hydro to produce green ammonia, which they will export to Europe. So again, the type of innovation which is taking place because of the initial opportunity provided by SECI as a counterpart is quite interesting. So yeah, I think if we have similar kind of sort of structures in other markets, it is possible to scale it up. But I would say each country has its own unique challenges. So I wouldn't advise that that's the only model to use. It's a serious issue because a lot of the development or financings done over the last few years was based on self-declared goals and guidelines. Obviously, now there is some level of standardization coming. But having said that, there is a still big gap between country by country, deal by deal, transaction by transaction, bank by bank. So
how do you protect yourself?
So I guess from our perspective, we've also come out with very clear guidelines in terms of what we call our transition finance principles or green finance principles. And we are more than happy to say no to deals than do a deal where we are exposed to that risk. So in a way, yes, there would be certain deals which are probably at the borderline, and ideally those may need to get financing, but we rather say no, because ultimately it is better for us as a bank which is as in really actively involved in this kind of transaction to be saying no to a client and telling them, I think you need to step up on these areas. And Moody's has already highlighted why these are areas of where you lack. So I think in a sense, even a lot of our clients have recognized that they need to step up their game a lot more significantly than what they were doing before. So green washing and transition washing, as you just mentioned, is a big worry for us. Yeah, I think what you said is true, that again, typically a large financial institution like us work best with our largest client, but it doesn't mean that we ignore our other stakeholders or other potential clients. So one example of the type of things we are doing is, for example, I'm taking Cambodia as an example, since CEO of Cambodia Stock Exchange is here. We have a sustainable finance joint framework with JICA, where we basically have created a framework where they will support us on certain transactions with blended or supported concessional funding. And we actually provided a two-step loan through Akleda Bank, which is listed in Cambodia Stock Exchange, if I'm not mistaken. We are a largest shareholder of Akleda Bank, and if I'm not mistaken, it's 20% of your stock exchange. So it's quite a large chunk of the $2 billion which you mentioned. But again, we couldn't go to the end users of that business, where I think, for example, Akleda is supporting the farming community in Cambodia or helping on energy efficiency projects, but providing on a two-step loan, and by partnering with JICA and therefore offering a much more concessional funding, we could basically provide this support to the people who we couldn't directly do on our own. So that's, I think, again, it all comes back to this partnership model, which we are all talking about. How do we do more of it? How do we scale it up? And how do we break the barriers between public and private to get to what you want to do? If I look at in different countries in Asia, a lot of the initial efforts on electrification has been actually done by the private sector on their own, and but then the scaling up of that is now going to require a lot more support from the governmental agencies. Again, if you take the example of two-wheeler electrification in India, it's already 10% of new two-wheelers sold in India are EV two-wheelers. This didn't happen because of governmental effort. This just happened because of natural tendencies of the customer and it became competitive enough because of the scale that they're going to buy these two-wheelers, and now you can just pull out your battery and charge it at home. And it's estimated that by 2030, I think 75% or 80% of two-wheelers in India will be electric two-wheelers. So again, I think what we are observing is sometimes a lot of these trends start irrespective of the government support or not. But how do we accelerate it? That's where I think the government comes in. And one interesting example, like we are directly involved, is in the maritime sector, which was mentioned earlier. Again, if you look at some of the countries where they use intermodal with ferries and others, they are always HSFO fire-powered engines, right? But we've actually put some equity into a platform called Purus Maritime, which is actually now involved in electrification of the intramodal transport. And that's quite interesting, because ultimately, when we talk about electrification, it's not just about the Teslas of the world. We have to talk about a lot more of other forms of transportation. And I think that's where entities like us, and I think GCF also mentioned this, how they can contribute to accelerating it. Green hydrogen or green ammonia for industrial use, I think we are reasonably close. Again, and in-country use, for example, green ammonia being produced in India will be used to replace ammonia being produced from other forms of naphtha, or for example, right? Yeah. But green hydrogen for transportation use, I think economically it is still a few years away. But it's definitely critical. And then as we talk about the mineral challenges of minerals, but also challenges about disposal of batteries. As in, these are challenges which are pushing back to the future. But unless we have hydrogen or other forms of more efficient ways of transport fuel, I think we will have issues. 1 year from now, I'm just hoping that the current crisis, which is with the banking crisis, doesn't lead to something more severe. So
Yeah,
we are
it's-
actually in a positive.
Rajeev, thanks for reminding
Yeah,
that there's
yeah.
something going on there.
Because we haven't seen the second and third degree effect of what's
Yes.
happening, and it's not the end yet. But being hopeful and looking forward, I believe we should all think forward into the future. But I think from breaking the barrier perspective, one area I would like banks like us and private sector to be a lot more involved is in water and urban waste. As in, we talked a lot about renewables, but I think those are two sectors where I see a significant under investment, and it's going to become a bigger and bigger challenge.
A few successes we've seen as well, right?
But yeah, so
Small
I'm
ones.
hoping that we can finance and close a couple of deals in that space.
Yeah.